Hey everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congressman Sean Casten. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
Something that really caught my eye last week, you introduced legislation that really has the potential to upend politics as we know it. Can you give us an overview of a common sense vision for American democracy?
Sure. The basic thing that was driving us is how many times does every member of Congress go home and their constituents say, we know that overwhelming majorities of the American people want X to happen, whatever that X thing is. And yet you guys aren't doing it, guys and gals. And the answer is that we actually have within the structure of our government these huge minoritarian provisions. The United States Senate is not a majoritarian institution. 17% of the American people elect half of the people in the Senate. Um, the Supreme Court is not an elected body, and the House amazingly has not grown since 1911. So we've had 3.5 times population growth, but no growth in the members of the House. So what we sought to do is to try to fix those three things and the Electoral College while we're at it, because I'm from Chicago, Daniel Burnham, make no small plans, so that we can try to make sure that we have a government closer to the vision that our founders laid out. As Thomas Jefferson said, government should represent the majority will. And if it's not, let's fix it.
According to a recent Gallup poll, Americans of both parties think that the biggest issue facing this country right now is government and poor leadership. How will adding these lawmakers solve that problem?
Well, so what we're trying to do again is make sure that those of us in government are responsive to the needs. So let's take just one of the three bills we introduced. It's a constitutional amendment to add 12 at-large senators to the Senate who would be elected nationally. So you would then have 10% of the Senate that would have to vote based on the will of the American people. Now that sounds like the way every senator votes, right? Except that if you actually look at the structure of the Senate, if you're a senator from Wyoming, you have to vote based on the will of 570 people, 1,000 people in Wyoming. And you have just as many votes on the Senate floor as someone from my home state of Illinois who represents 13 million people, or someone from California who represents 40 million people. So he said, let's expand the Senate to provide a block of senators who are responsive to public will, still have the structure of the Senate as we sit, but to make sure that you now have a body that is better able to do what the American people want. We've done some similar changes in the House, but that's the idea, is to make us accountable to the American people.
Sure. I want to break down that senator part. Where did you get the number 12 for these 12 at-large senators?
Oh, there's no magic to it. And if somebody really wanted it to be a bigger number, we'd certainly support that. The honest answer is we wanted, because the senators serve 6-year terms, and every 2 years there are senates up for vote. We wanted to do a number that was a multiple of 3, so that over the course of 3 2-year periods over a 6-year term, you could elect all of them. And so 9 felt like too few, 15 felt like too many, so we landed at 12. There's no magic to that, but it does have the happy coincidence of saying this is 10%. It's a 10% block of the Senate. It's big enough to be meaningful, not so big as to completely change the body in unpredictable ways.
Sure. And would these 12 senators have more power than other senators because they're not beholden to their state, opposed to, let's say, a senator from Illinois?
No, like every senator has the same amount of power, right? You get 1 vote on the Senate floor, you serve on committees, you have constituents you represent. So there's no greater power other than, I suppose the fact that, right now, senators from small states have, disproportionately greater power than senators from big states. But it's basically the same structure, again, just with the idea that we want to fix the Senate. I want to give an example to help understand, because this all sounds very academic without details. Last year, we passed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Passed out of the House, passed out of the Senate, the president signed it. It made lynching a federal crime, was named after Emmett Till, whose murder, in many ways triggered the civil rights era in the 60s. That bill first passed the House in 1922. It took 100 years for the United States Senate to decide that lynching was bad. Like, you have to put that in context, right? In 1922, when this first passed the House, Emmett Till wasn't even born yet. Martin Luther King wasn't born yet. Malcolm X wasn't born yet. Medgar Evers wasn't born yet. How many lives have been lost because the Senate structurally is not doing what the American American people want. And it's with that sort of understanding of what the Senate does that says, well, what would have happened differently if 10% of the Senate was pushing for the public will? Those people would have been less likely to filibuster the bill that we sent over, more likely to vote for it. We know it was popular because the House of Representatives that represents all the American people passed it again and again and again and again over those 100 years. So it's those types of problems we're trying to fix.
And putting that into perspective is very interesting, but I do want to get down to the brass tacks. How are we picking these senators?
So what we did, it would be a nationally elected, so you would vote for them in the same way that you would vote in a presidential election. Now, everybody votes on the same day, right? So it would just be on your ballot. We've said we'll vote for them every 2 years. And then really at the recommendation from a lot of good government people in Washington, we decided to do it through a system of ranked choice voting, which has been proven to be very effective in places like Maine, where you would vote for your first choice and your second choice and your third choice. Voters just saw what happened in Alaska that did that Mary Peltola came in, who was a much more moderate centrist person than the people running at the extremes. But everybody said, this is kind of who I want. And in a ranked choice voting system, you get that. So what we've said is let's elect these senators on a ranked choice basis. But other than that, would be elected in the same way as any other senator.
And this would be an amendment to the Constitution. So as of now, as we're sitting here, this is not constitutional?
Yes, we would have to add that any expansion of the Senate would have to be an amendment to the Constitution. In this fact, because the Constitution only contemplates that every state has 2 senators. There's no protocol within the Constitution to expand the numbers. The proposal we've introduced to expand the House, by contrast, doesn't require a constitutional amendment because the House has always grown as population grows, as states have moved around. There's no magic number that each state will only get a certain number of members. So we were able to introduce a separate piece of legislation to expand the House without a constitutional amendment. But on the Senate, it would take an amendment.
And let's talk about the House piece of this legislation. How many members would you be adding to the House of Representatives?
So what we've done on the House side is really just to change the math. Right now, every time we do the census, so every 10 years, the one we just got through in 2020, we redivide the population of America by 435, which is the number of seats in the House. And that sets the number of districts that the number of constituents every member of the House represents. We don't have to do it that way. You could imagine a different piece of math that said, let's make sure that every House member continues to represent the same number of people and increase the number of members in the House, right? What we've done here is to say, at the next census in 2030, let's look at the population of the smallest state in the country and set that state to be the size of a congressional district. Right now, I represent 730,000 people, roughly. And remember what I said before, there's only 570,000 people in the state of Wyoming, which means that a person from Wyoming has greater representation in the House of Representatives than someone who lives in the 6th congressional district in Illinois, because proportionally there's more representation per person. And so what we've done is say, let's set the smallest state to be the size of a district. If we had done that in the last census, that would have added about 130 seats to the House on 435. So it's significant, but it doesn't break the institution. And again, keep in mind that that last time the House was expanded was in 1920. Our population was so much smaller then that if I was in my seat then, I only would have represented about 200,000 people. So this is not going back to what we were before the last time the House was expanded, but I think is a directional corrective.
So you're saying this will, level the playing field?
It would make the body that much more representative because we'd have more representatives representing proportionately fewer people. It would make it more likely that when people like me go home to our districts, we run into our constituents, right? Just because you have fewer constituents. It would make the House much more diverse in almost every measure because, as a body that is much older, much wider, much more male than the population, and given the power of incumbency, creating a cadre of new people would necessarily make it more diverse. And so if we're more diverse, if we are closer to our constituents, it's going to make the House more representative. The other thing it would do, and this is important, along with the Senate bill, the number of electors in the Electoral College is the number of members of the House plus the number of members of the Senate. So by expanding the number of electors, And by making congressional districts smaller, it reduces the range of scenarios where the winner of the popular vote in a presidential election would lose the electoral vote. There's only 4 times in our history that that's happened. 2 of them have been in the last 23 years. And that's a function of the fact that because the population has grown so much faster than the House, which is the number of electors, it's created a situation which is untenable. And I think, as those of us who have lived through the last 23 years know, there are some legitimacy problems you run into as a president when you lose the popular vote that limits your ability to get things done. So the idea is it would make our presidency more effective as well.
Congressman, as you know, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote back in 2016, but lost the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court has a conservative majority. So are the proposals that you're suggesting meant to tip the scales in favor of Democrats?
Well, I could go even stronger than that. Remember, Al Gore won the popular vote against the second Bush. And yes, without question, if Al Gore had been president and Hillary Clinton had been president, we would have a different cast of characters on the Supreme Court and a whole host of issues from Citizens United to the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade to dramatic changes in gun control would have been decided differently, one presumes. For those 3 issues, though, if you look at this as they would help Democrats, I suppose you can. I would encourage you not to look at that way, though. 2/3 of the country believes in preserving Roe. The overwhelming majority of the country believes that we need universal background checks for guns and should have an assault weapons ban. Huge majorities of the country think we should get dark money out of politics. The fact that those decisions were decided in ways that sort of oppose what Democrats want is one way to look at it. But they were decided in ways that oppose what the majority of the people want. And what I would submit, and what I've said to my Republican colleagues, is we have evolved because of these minoritarian parts of our government into a world where we have 2 parties. One of the parties wins popular votes and seeks to earn the support of the majority of the American people. The other party, its power derives from those minoritarian institutions like the Senate, like the Electoral College, like the Supreme Court. And it has greatly weakened the Republican Party. My friends in the Republican Party who are moderate and reasonable are sitting there saying, why is it that our party's agenda is being driven by Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene? Why is my voice not higher? And the answer is because their party is pushing towards the minoritarian institutions, not towards the majority view of the American people. And so if we weaken those minoritarian institutions, I think it creates 2 much more healthy parties that are consistently competing for that Senate.
As government is set up right now, though, would Republicans support this? Do you think you have bipartisan support? What has the response been to this package?
So we just introduced it last week, and it's probably too soon to tell. I will tell you that I've heard nothing negative about it from my Republican colleagues, but it is hard. Like, look, leadership is hard. Pushing to change things is hard, and I think it takes time to socialize this and talk through it. But every one of my colleagues, to a person, would prefer to be in a world where when they go home to their district, they're having conversations that are supported by the majority of their colleagues. I'll give you, I'm almost reluctant to tell a story. When I came into Congress by flipping a seat that had been Republican for 50 years. When I took over the office, the district office that was there had been lined with Kevlar walls because my predecessor was concerned about people coming in and attacking him. I mean, how horrible to have that fear. I've never had that fear. Hopefully I'll never have that fear in this line of work. But that's the kind of environment that's created when your route to power depends on opposing the majority will. And so whether Republican or Democratic, I think all would agree that we are better off if we get this through. We just have to find a way to get it through.
Since you might not have the support right now, is this about getting the package through Congress, or is this more about injecting this into the national debate, starting a conversation?
Well, anything this ambitious, the first step is to start the conversation, of course. But I would point out that there's a big difference between Republican voters and elected Republicans. When I talk about 2/3 of the country being in favor of keeping the protections of Roe, 2/3 of the country is not Democratic, right? Those are significant pieces of both parties. Assault weapons ban, campaign bans, these are not inherently partisan reasons. They're partisan in Washington. But I think it's important to understand that the agenda of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party nationally doesn't always mirror exactly to the agenda of those of us in Washington who represent those parties. And so I think if we're doing this well, it's about making sure that we have a government that is responsive to the majority of the American people, regardless of their political ideology.
And what has been the response, not from lawmakers, from the American people? I know you just introduced this bill last week, but what have your constituents been saying?
So we're just starting that process. What I really, what I've found useful about the conversation, and let me come back to how I started. How many times has everybody said, including me when I was first thinking about running for office, our government isn't working because it's not doing what the majority of the American people want? And we then come up with theories for why that is. Well, it's because they're all corrupt. It's because they spend all their time fundraising. It's because of gerrymandering. We have all these theories. And I'm not saying that there's not, some degree of truth, certainly with some members to maybe some of those theories. But what's been really helpful for me in this conversation is it's been a way to educate the American people, to get them to understand that it is one thing to elect good people of sterling moral character. It is something else to make sure that the institution that they work in is responsive to what you want as a voter. And if we know that those institutions are, by their design, frustrating the will of the voters, then this is a chance to fix the conversation, and I think to elevate the conversation a little bit. And I think, certainly the folks that I've had the privilege to talk to about this back home have really appreciated that perspective, to realize that we all have some agency in fixing this. Right? Not just who we elect, but also if we care about this government, let's not only preserve it, but improve it.
Of course. And this, obviously, as we've been talking, has the potential to upend the physics of politics. Do you think you have an advantage here, not being a lifelong politician, coming in with these more fresh eyes than someone who is a career politician, to see, this is an unprecedented move, but I think it could work?
Well, it's flattering of you to say that. Some would say naive, some say fresh eyes. But I think coming into politics late in life, as I did, it makes you realize what an amazing blessing it is to have this job. I mean, I pinch myself that I'm sitting here talking to you in the Capitol, that I have the same job that Abraham Lincoln had, that John F. Kennedy had. And the only question is, during whatever brief time I had this job, did I make it better? Did I leave the campsite in a better position than I found it? And I think, if I had spent all my career in politics, maybe it wouldn't feel so special. I don't know. But as it is, it certainly feels very special. And I feel a certain obligation to say, if you have the power to fix the institution and you see a place where it's broken, you have an obligation to fix, right? Not just an opportunity, but an obligation. And I hope that, I hope people see it that way. And I hope that all my colleagues see and treat this job as the privilege and the responsibility that it is.
And perhaps in modern history, you are the first sitting member of Congress to enact this type of reform. So why do you think this is such an unprecedented move? Why are you the first to do it?
Well, to be fair, there have been proposals in the past to expand the House. I'm not aware of proposals to expand the Senate, but I wouldn't want to say that limits what it is. The other proposal we have to change some of the authority of the Supreme Court, there's a lot of pushback on there. So I think, what we're talking about fixing is lots of people have tried to address these problems in other ways. And, and these solutions all fit together and interlock in various fashions. But I wouldn't say I'm the first to try to make this place better. I mean, we have amended our Constitution some 29 times at this point, right? This is just one more time in a long series of improvements.
I meant specifically with the Senate. You're the first that I have found to expand the Senate. So why do you think you're ready to just make a constitutional amendment where other people have never gone through with this idea if they've had it?
I I I I would be speculating if I said that. I think there is certainly, one of the jokes here in the House is that every member of the House thinks that someday they'll be a member of the Senate, and every member of the Senate thinks that one day they'll be president. And it is possible that maybe a lot of my colleagues were reluctant to criticize an institution that they'd like to join someday. But that would be my it's the best theory I've got. Put it that way.
Got it. And what's next for your legislation? Is this a top priority for you?
Yeah, so I mean, we've literally introduced them a week ago. We've, given a floor speech, starting to talk to getting some other members on board with co-sponsoring. Mechanically, of course, the way things work around here is you'd have to get them referred to a committee and pass through. I realistically, I think the current Republican leadership in the House is probably less likely to bring these forward, but we'll have those conversations, with the friends where we can. But I think right now it's about elevating the conversation, getting people to understand why our government works the way it does and how we can improve it. And the sooner that happens, the sooner we have sort of other degrees of freedom to try to move this into binding legislation.
Congressman, I really appreciate you hopping on here today, breaking down your legislation, and I hope you come back again. Thank you so much, Congressman Sean Casten.
Thank you.